The Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri, Canto 1. The journey begins for Dante when at some stage he finds himself in a dark wood where he could not find a way out. He is consequently overwhelmed with panic and distress. As I said in a previous podcast, Dante encrypts a message in every phenomenon of the Commedia, and we need to decode, so to speak, everything he says. This wood or forest, therefore, in which Dante finds himself is an image of alienation from God through sin and moral decadence. This is obvious when Dante says that in this dark wood, the straight path was wholly lost and gone. The straight path being an allusion to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 14. Straight is the gate, and narrow is the way that leads to life, and few there are who find it. One may be in vice and sin and find it difficult to get back to the right track, or the straight and narrow, as some call it, because it is no longer visible. One cannot see right from wrong, good from bad. And hence, one like Dante finds himself in a dark wood. Eventually, Dante sees a way out when he finds himself at the foot of a steep hill and sees the sun shining at the summit. The sight of it brings him relief and consolation. After a moment of respite, he begins to climb the hill, which he also calls a desert because of its barren appearance. We shall see eventually that this hill is Mount Purgatory. He adds a curious detail about his ascent or his attempt at ascending here when he says that as he climbed, his fixed foot was lower than the foot that was moving. To understand this, one looks back at the whole mechanism, so to speak, of climbing up a steep hill. The fixed foot is always higher so that the other foot can move. It does not make sense, therefore, to say that the fixed foot is lower when one is ascending, unless Dante is trying to tell us something here, and we shall come to this. The hill at the foot of which Dante finds himself represents the ideal of the Christian life of integrity, virtue, and salvation. And the sun shining at the summit of the hill represents God, who is the object and goal of this life of virtue and integrity. There are moments, in spite of sin and vice, when there is at the same time a longing and even an effort to start climbing the hill. But the longing is fleeting and the effort is meager. Why? And Dante gives us two reasons. The first, as he says, is because the fixed foot is lower than the moving foot in our ascent. Both feet are an image of the intellect and the will, which are prime movers in human behavior and activity. And both should always go together. When the mind perceives a truth and good to be pursued, the will should naturally second this perception by making a prompt, wholehearted, and effective effort to reach out for it. In the situation described by Dante, however, one foot moves forward, but the other seems to lag behind, dragging itself as it were. One foot represents the mind moving ahead. The other foot represents the will lagging behind. Is this not true of our efforts to be holy and virtuous? The intellect, the mind, knows with all clarity and fullness where the truth is and how to attain to it, but the will, sluggish, struggles in making an all-out effort to reach out for that good. And why this struggling? Why this sluggishness and struggling? Dante again gives us the clue. He says that as soon as he tried to go up, he was confronted by three animals, one by one. First, a leopard came gamboling out, but this did not seem to frighten Dante when it should. But Dante says that the sight of it, together with the beautiful morning, filled him more with hope and cheerful auguries. It was only when the leopard was followed by a lion and then by a wolf that Dante took fright and found himself back in that state of panic that he had felt when he was in the dark wood. In fact, it was the sight of the last two animals that kept him back from climbing further, and even to find himself being driven back into the dark wood. The leopard signifies lust, the lion, pride, the wolf, greed. Lust, pride, greed, these are the three things that weaken and hamper and undermine the alacrity of the will in the direction of righteousness and virtue. Dante says that the leopard did not frighten him, rather it amused him, if we can put it that way. Indeed, lust, or let us call it generally, an unguarded sensuality, engenders a certain levity, frivolity, a certain light-heartedness, light-mindedness more like, that holds one back from taking things seriously, especially the things that pertain to religion and salvation. Pride and greed, on the other hand, do frighten us, in the sense that pride makes us afraid that there will always be someone superior to oneself when one believes that one is superior overall. Greed frightens us. In a sense, we are afraid of losing things that constitute our material security, which can drive some people to irrationally strive for more without setting a limit. It is this excessive irrational fear that warps the will, so that even when one knows the truth, one cannot bring oneself to accept nor to pursue it because of the fear of losing our dignity and superiority to others, or to lose or miss a chance at conserving or augmenting our material security. The consequence of such levity and fear is regression and stagnation in the dark wood. Dante is about to fall back into the woods, into a crisis again, when a figure crosses his path. It is the poet Virgil, whom Dante admires and whose style of poetry he has been trying to emulate. Virgil recommends to Dante that he would have to take another path to get out of the wood. It is a path that must first lead through hell, and then he would have access up the mountain, which is purgatory, and finally arrive at the Paradiso. Who is Virgil in this context, and what is the significance of his recommendation? In the context of the Commedia, Virgil is the embodiment of humanism, which can be broadly defined as that framework of ideals and values which effectively inspire the material as well as the moral growth of individuals and societies. Humanism generally is secular, not religious. But this does not mean that it does not have a potential to foster moral good. Consider the humanism of the Renaissance, for example, when there was a rediscovery of ideals and values that were encrypted in the writings of classical antiquity. a rediscovery that launched a moral revival in Europe at every level, at the level of education, politics, economy, and even religion. We shall have a look again at this issue of humanism and religion at the end of the next canto. Humanism can inspire and foster the moral good by means of literature, which has always been a vehicle of expression for humanistic ideals. An example of this in our own postmodern age is how some can rid themselves of substance abuse, alcoholism, and other forms of indecent behavior through reading self-help books that draw on a wealth of ancient wisdom, such as Stoicism, to provide guidance and encouragement to those who, like Dante the Pilgrim in the Commedia, aspire and struggle to live a clean life. Those who have recourse to such self-help books also do know that the first thing they want the reader to do is to confront himself with the truth about himself and what he is doing, to realize the negative impact his immoral behavior has on himself and others. Only then, with such a realization, can one proceed to rehabilitation and healing. This is the meaning of Virgil's proposition to Dante to descend into hell and see the torments of the damned. In the context of the Commedia, apart from being an eschatological milieu of eternal damnation, hell is an allegory of that category of the human condition of despair, anguish, guilt, shame, bitterness, resentment, and emptiness that constitute the psychological state of one who is becoming alienated from God even further and is becoming more fixated in moral decadence. To descend into hell, therefore, the hell of the Commedia, is not so much to browse through a rogue's gallery of reprobate characters, but to see and realize deep down what happens to a person psychologically when he or she persists in vice and immorality. It is to be hoped that the impact of horror at the realization of it all would be more than enough to wrench the mind and the heart from all affection for things that are immoral and turn one back to the straight and narrow. Canto 2. Dante, in response, at first jumps at the Virgil's idea of taking the route through hell. But he immediately begins to renege when he remembered having read Virgil's horrendous description of hell in the 6th book of the Aeneid. Dante, therefore, begins to make such excuses as not being worthy, since he was not someone famous or predestined like Aeneas or St. Paul to make such a journey. Indeed, the thought of having to confront oneself with the truth about oneself is never pleasant. And it is for that reason that many people prefer withdrawal and denial than to be confronted with the truth. But then the consequence of such denial is pure frustration and stagnation. There is always the struggle between reluctance, hesitation, fear on the one hand, and on the other, aspirations, optimism, courage. Which side will win? In response, Virgil reprimands Dante for his cowardice, and in order to encourage and reassure him, tells him it was because of the heavenly intervention of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who had entrusted Dante's predicament to St. Lucy. In her turn, St. Lucy communicated with Beatrice, who then approached Virgil, where he was in limbo, to give him a mission to guide Dante out of the wood. The awareness of this heavenly intervention revives courage and confidence in Dante, who promptly sets aside all misgiving, surrenders himself to be guided by Virgil, and embarks on a fearsome journey. Here, I believe it is important to appreciate the significance of these 4 characters in rescuing Dante from his predicament. In the Middle Ages, the Blessed Virgin Mary had a paramount role in assuring salvation. Indeed, she was regarded equal to Christ in authority and power, in granting every grace to all those who had recourse to her patronage and intercession. Dante brings this out very clearly when he makes Beatrice inform Virgil that it was because the Blessed Virgin Mary had pity on Dante that the whole chain of events in the Commedia was set in motion. St. Lucy was a very popular saint in medieval Italy, where she was venerated in two places, at Venice, where her body lies, and at Syracuse in Sicily, where she lived and suffered martyrdom. Apparently, Dante had a devotion to her, and I believe it was because she was known for obtaining healing for those who suffered from ailments affecting the eyes. Did Dante suffer from such an affliction? We do not know. But Dante the poet mentions her more in connection with ailments of spiritual instead of physical vision. That is to say, Dante the pilgrim has lost his spiritual vision of the truth and needs to have this vision restored through St. Lucy's intervention. It is curious what Dante says about Beatrice. When she was alive, she hardly seems to have paid him any attention. Now, however, she is said to have great concerns for his salvation. I think the important thing, however, here is to consider her role and function rather than her actual relationship with Dante, which Dante has already elaborated on in two previous works, the Vita Nuova and the Convivio. Here in the Commedia, however, Dante portrays Beatrice in another light, that is, as an allegory of grace, which works to save Dante through this dynamic whereby grace comes from the Blessed Virgin Mary. And with St. Lucy, we realize this grace is above all the grace of spiritual enlightenment, spiritual and moral enlightenment to perceive truth in its fullness. This grace operates through that which is familiar and which has influence on Dante, which is poetry, the poetry of Virgil in this case. It is through this dynamic that grace operates to revive, animate, and sustain the traveler on his journey. We see here also in this episode the connection between religion and secularism. I mentioned earlier how humanism in the Renaissance was a purely secular thing. Dante, however, lived in the Middle Ages where humanism was never purely secular. Medieval humanism was an integration of the sacred and the secular, and a magnificent manifestation of this humanism is the Commedia, where Dante blends Christian belief, morality, and religious experience on the one hand, with classical literature, Aristotelian philosophy, and science on the other, to show how both categories have one and the same objective, that is, to effectively help to bring to fruition the potential of every human individual to develop every aspect of himself, intellectual, emotional, material, moral, and come eventually to the knowledge of the truth, which brings enduring fulfillment for himself and for the society in which he exists. This is the underlying theme of the Commedia. Like other medieval humanists, perhaps more than any other medieval humanist, Dante believed in marrying both religion and secularism, because both categories have a mutual need for each other. Religion needs humanism because dogmatic formulas and moral definitions can be too cut and dry and will never appeal or attract unless religion allies itself with art, music, and poetry, which will give it vitality and dynamism. Humanism has need of religion to ensure continuity and permanence for its values and ideals, which, being human, like everything human, are transient, unless they are embellished by that vital element in religion, grace, which carries everything human, beyond its limitations to be something perennially life-giving. To allow a dichotomy between religion and secularism is to relive once more the consequences of the same dichotomy during the Renaissance, which was the Reformation. And the world has never recovered from the Reformation. In conclusion, what does this reluctance of Dante and his eventual gumption mean for the reader? One realizes how necessary moral and emotional support from friends and family are in one's efforts to reform and rehabilitate oneself. When that is lacking, one remains stuck in anxiety, frustration, and discouragement. What Dante teaches here in the Canto, therefore, is that the only way we can keep such discouragement and anxiety at bay is to realize that there are supernatural powers who do have a vested interest and concern for our moral and spiritual well-being. And as we see the Blessed Virgin Mary, St. Lucy, and Beatrice, these powers are not just passive spectators, but active supporters who are always at the ready to help us through the grace, that comes in so many subtle ways. We only have to stay tuned to these movements of grace to keep our courage and confidence going. No one is alone. There are people who do care. And not only do they care, they are making every effort to help. And they are not earthly, but heavenly. Angels, saints, God Himself.